Hello everyone. Before we begin, please be sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment if you wish to hear more stories that were never intended to surface. Her grandfather married her when she was 13 years old. Just let that sink in for a moment. A child barely entering her teenage years was forced into the role of wife, tied by blood to a man who should have been her protector, not her husband. This wasn't love. It wasn't family. It was a prison constructed from the sickness of isolation, the silence of the mountains, and the rot that flourishes when no one is watching. In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, a different kind of lineage was being written, where dirt roads wound endlessly and families were caught within valleys too deep for outsiders to penetrate. It wasn't etched into history books or transmitted through official records. It lived in whispers, in faces that seemed too alike, in the hush that descended whenever strangers posed questions. For the girl at the center of this tale, her entire life was already determined before she even drew her first breath. Her grandfather was an old man, decades her senior. Yet, in those mountains, power wasn't measured by age. It was measured by control. Families like hers lived in almost total seclusion, with no schools, no churches, no laws pressing in from the outside world. Blood was the only thing that bound people together, and blood became the only thing people shared. Over time, the lines blurred until husband became grandfather, father became cousin, and son became brother. When neighbors, if you could even call them that, saw her walking beside him, they didn't look shocked. They looked away, because in those forgotten corners of America, shame was swallowed, not spoken. Every family carried their own sins, and survival relied solely on silence. The girl herself did not know what life could have been. To her, this was neither crime nor rebellion. It was inheritance. And as she carried that inheritance in her small, frail body, she began to display the deformities of a bloodline that had folded in on itself for far too long. A face that was both aged and childlike, eyes set too closely, a jaw that never quite formed right. She became a living emblem of what occurs when a family turns inward, consuming itself alive. But this isn't solely her story. It is the story of how entire families, entire generations, chose silence over truth. And that silence extracted its price in flesh. By the time she reached 15, the damage was already irreversible. Her body showed signs of exhaustion, not from laboring in the fields, but from the strain of bearing children while she was still a child herself. Her first pregnancy was whispered about among the older women, though none dared to intervene. The child, born sickly and weak, barely took a breath before fading away. Yet, instead of grief, the family responded with a cold inevitability. Death was simply a part of their pattern. Life was fragile when blood was never permitted to mix with anything new. Her grandfather, her husband, treated her as property, not a person, an extension of his own legacy. To him, she was a vessel to carry his name forward, even if that name was doomed by deformity. What started as a single, twisted union spread like a poison through the generations, branching and rebranching until nieces, nephews, cousins, and uncles all merged into one indistinguishable lineage. The family tree was not a tree at all, but a circle tightening with every generation until escape was impossible. Neighbors, when they did visit, would sometimes notice the uncanny resemblance among the children, eyes that mirrored each other too closely, voices that carried the same slurred cadence, limbs that bent in unnatural ways. Yet, nobody spoke openly. In a world where survival was dictated by poverty, a family's sins were buried, not exposed. Outsiders may have muttered about the strange folks up in the holler, but few dared climb the mountains to see for themselves. Those who did rarely returned with more than stories, stories that sounded too grotesque to be real. The young bride, trapped in that cruel cycle, had no language for what she endured. Education had never touched her life. She couldn't read, couldn't write, couldn't imagine a world beyond the narrow path between the woods and her cabin. To her, obligation was indistinguishable from love, and the only form of survival was obedience. She became withdrawn, quiet, almost ghost-like. A girl who should have been dreaming, playing, discovering the world instead became an unwilling monument to her family's darkest secret. And as she aged, still tied to the man who should have been her grandfather, her body twisted further under the weight of genetic collapse, the features of inbreeding became unmistakable, and the echo of that collapse grew louder with each new child. What began as silence was turning into a curse written in blood. By her 20s, she was already old. Not in years, but in the way her body carried itself, weary, bent, worn down by a fate that had been sealed long before her birth. Her children did not grow strong. Some came into the world lifeless. Others carried the unmistakable marks of the family's lineage, twisted jaws, crossed eyes, limbs too short for their bodies, and minds that never progressed beyond infancy. In those mountains, people saw everything but said little. A single glance at her family was enough to tell outsiders that something was profoundly wrong. The holler where they lived became a kind of prison. Outsiders avoided it, and those who belonged there rarely ever left. People whispered that God had forsaken that bloodline, leaving them to rot in the shadows as punishment for their sins. But the truth was simpler and much darker. It wasn't divine wrath. It was human choice. Year after year, generation after generation, families closed themselves off, refusing to allow new blood to enter. What resulted was not merely a deformity of the flesh, but a collapse of the spirit. The woman herself became nearly unrecognizable. Rare and faded photographs show a face caught between age and childhood, with features that never quite aligned. A smile that looked more like a grimace. Eyes that seemed lost, searching for something beyond the mountains, but finding only silence. She had no voice in her own story. She never consented, never chose. She was born into a bloodline that decided for her, and every decision led her deeper into the same cycle of despair. For those few outsiders who dared to write about such families, the descriptions are chilling. Children raised without schooling, without even a concept of the outside world. Adults who spoke in garbled patterns, their minds clouded by years of genetic isolation, homes falling apart, patched together with scraps of wood and filled with silence broken only by the cries of sickly infants. And at the center of it all, this woman who had once been a child bride, carrying the unbearable weight of her family's choices on her fragile frame. It is here that the horror is most clearly revealed. She was not just a victim of her grandfather. She was a victim of time, of tradition, of silence itself. Every generation that turned away, every neighbor who refused to speak, every official who ignored the signs, they all helped construct her prison. The family's collapse wasn't sudden. It was slow, quiet, and deliberate, hidden deep in the Appalachian woods where no one wanted to look. If you're still watching, you are already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this were your bloodline? Would the silence have swallowed you too, or would you have broken free? By the time the outside world began to notice, the damage was generations deep. Social workers, journalists, and photographers who ventured into the Appalachian back roads came back haunted. They spoke of families who seemed almost frozen in time, trapped in the same cabins their ancestors built, repeating the same mistakes with no end in sight. The woman, now known by some as the most inbred in the Appalachian, was no longer merely a person, but a symbol. Her face became evidence of what silence can create. What happens when a community allows secrecy to grow unchecked? Yet, behind the whispers, behind the label, there was still a person. Imagine her for a moment. A girl who never had the chance to choose her own future. A woman forced to marry a man who should have been her protector. A mother who watched her children enter the world already broken by the past. She bore the cruelty of the mountains, the shame of her family, and the quiet judgment of strangers who came to stare but never to help. The photographs that circulate now, grainy, unsettling, unforgettable, show her with that haunting, hollow expression. You can almost hear the silence in her eyes. You can almost feel the weight of generations pressing down on her shoulders. She wasn't born to be infamous. She was born innocent, unknowing, like any child. But her life was stolen from the very beginning by choices she never made. And her story still lingers because it speaks to something larger than one family. It speaks to the hidden rot beneath the surface of American history. While the nation was constructing cities, industries, and railroads, there were pockets left behind. Pockets where law and light never reached. In those pockets, families turned inward, secrets thrived, and children became sacrifices to silence. The Appalachian Mountains are filled with beauty, but beauty can be deceiving. Some of the darkest truths this country has ever hidden lie behind those rolling hills. And for her, those hills were walls, not freedom. Her story does not conclude with redemption. There was no escape, no sudden deliverance, no outsider who carried her away from the mountains. She lived and died within the same walls, on the same dirt paths, surrounded by the same blood that had bound her since birth. Generations passed, and the family name became synonymous with secrecy, deformity, and shame. The whispers grew into legends, and the legends became something more chilling, a cautionary tale of what occurs when a family turns against the natural order and hides their sins behind silence. The truth is that she was not alone. There were many others, whose lives followed the same pattern. Daughters forced into unions with grandfathers, fathers, and uncles. Sons who grew up never knowing the difference between child, cousin, and brother. Whole bloodlines folded into themselves until deformity dissolved identity. And yet, the world, for the most part, chose to look away. Poverty was easier to ignore than to fix. And so these stories sank deeper into the soil, only resurfacing when someone stumbled across them by accident, horrified by what they found. When people speak of American history, they often speak of triumph, of freedom, of progress. But stories like hers are hidden beneath those shining words. Stories that remind us that history is not solely written by the victors. It is also written in the scars of those who were abandoned, forgotten, and erased. She never chose to be the face of inbreeding in the Appalachian. She never asked to be remembered in this way, and yet she became an unwilling monument to the cruelty of silence and the dangers of isolation. Think for a moment about the weight of that. A child forced into marriage by her own grandfather. A life spent carrying the deformities of a bloodline collapsing in on itself. A story whispered in the shadows, passed down in fragments until finally it surfaced as proof of what many had always feared, that beneath the surface of America's heartland, there are roots so dark, so twisted that most people would rather pretend they don't exist. And that is why we tell her story here. Not to sensationalize her suffering, but to remember that these things are real, that they happened, that behind every unsettling detail, behind every haunting photograph, there was a living, breathing human being. One whose life was consumed by silence and whose memory now serves as a warning. Some truths, no matter how deeply buried, can't stay hidden forever.